Hello, this webinar is titled Resistance to Tyrants is Obedience to God, an Introduction, and we'll take a look at manliness and courage further in this. So what started all this? Well, the Reformation began in Germany with Martin Luther in the early 1500s, joined by John Calvin in France and Switzerland, and also John Knox in Scotland. If Martin Luther was the hammer of the Reformation and John Calvin the pen, John Knox was the trumpet. Well, John Calvin had this idea that God dispenses his authority into four institutions: the individual, the family, church, and civil government. And within each of those institutions, God gives specific authorities. John Knox particularly explored the civil authority, and when the civil authority overflows its banks like a river. What happens when the civil authority begins to take over and dominate the church, the family, and the individual? John Knox's biblical theory was that the church, family, and individuals should push back against that civil overreach. He wrote this in a defense of the biblical doctrine of resistance to wicked and tyrannical civil magistrates in 1564. He said this, that subjects not only may, but also ought to withstand and resist their princes whensoever they do anything expressly repugning, that is, reject, oppose, or refute, things that God allows or directs. In other words, things that are contrary to God's design, His law, or holy ordinance. Resistance to tyranny is obedience to God, was the summarizing of this theme. And so the church, the family, the individual was to resist the civil government overflowing its jurisdictional boundaries. But ideally, in Knox's theory, the primary resistance should be from what's called the lesser magistrates. And so those lower government officials should resist tyranny that is occurring or coming down from above them. And so when you have the church, family, and individuals resisting, and the lesser magistrates resisting, then civil government can be made healthy again, and the four institutions can operate in their areas of jurisdiction and in their balanced fashion. John Knox was one of the most heroic leaders and towering figures in the annals of church history, regarded as the father of the Scottish Reformation and the founder of the Scottish Protestant Church. Knox was a spiritual tour de force of unmatched vigor in spreading the kingdom of God. With resolute convictions, this fiery reformer established his native land as an impenetrable fortress of biblical truth, one that would reverberate throughout the known world. He was a man. 200 years later, Jonathan Mayhew picked up this baton. He wrote a sermon called A Discourse Concerning Unlimited Submission and Non-Resistance to the Higher Powers. It was January 30th, 1750, this sermon was given. Its theme, Resistance to Tyrants is Obedience to God. John Adams called this the morning gun of the American Revolution. The Founding Fathers replaced a word and said rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. In fact, this was the motto suggested for the seal of the United States. The image was that of God as a pillar of fire, Israel on the shore being delivered from its enemies, Pharaoh's army covered up by the sea. This never became our national seal, although it was really considered, but Thomas Jefferson eventually used it for his own seal. The source of the motto was Benjamin Franklin, but the fountainhead of that was John Knox and his theory on biblical resistance. Resistance to tyranny is obedience to God, thus the name of this series. I encourage you to consider these things as we go through this series. My name's Craig Seibert. Thanks for listening.